In Babylon, justice came with a price that could be counted in broken bones, severed limbs, and the silence of the condemned. But what if the real cost wasn't the lives of the punished, but the blood-stained ledgers of those who wielded this power? Hammurabi didn't just create laws. He designed a system of pain, turning suffering into currency and fear into a tool of governance. What kind of mind could turn cruelty into order? And who really paid for it? The chronicles don't tell us, but clay tablets and the remnants of broken bodies will. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. In the ancient world, justice wasn't about fairness, it was about power. And the price for justice in Babylon was high, measured in physical agony and human suffering. Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, didn't just draft laws to govern a kingdom. He built a system, a meticulous system, where pain became not only a consequence, but a tool for maintaining control. His laws weren't just rules. They were blueprints for how to structure a society based on fear and pain. Each punishment was designed to hurt, not just the criminal, but the community itself. An eye for an eye wasn't just a moral principle. It was a transaction, calculated in terms of what pain could buy: obedience. If you stole a sheep, your hand was taken. If you caused harm to someone, you paid with your life. Justice in Babylon was about establishing a moral economy, where human suffering was the currency and fear the foundation. But here's the unsettling truth. It wasn't just the criminals who paid. The true cost of Hammurabi's laws was in the blood-stained ledgers of those who enforced them. While the lives of the punished were physically shattered, the power of those who created and wielded these laws grew ever stronger. Hammurabi didn't just punish, he used pain as governance, turning every act of suffering into a display of authority. What kind of person could design such a system? What kind of mind could turn cruelty into something so organized, so calculated, and so deeply embedded into the fabric of society? These were not just rulers, they were architects of anguish. They didn't just break bones, they broke spirits, and they did so with precision. The architects of this cruel system knew something the rest of the world didn't. Pain, if administered correctly, could be more powerful than gold. Fear could control entire populations. And those who wielded this power didn't just keep it, they expanded it, using every instance of suffering as a public spectacle. For them, justice was a stage, and the criminal was the unwitting actor. The message? Disobedience is unthinkable, and those who challenge authority will be made examples of. So who really paid for this system? The victims, of course, but also the people who lived under it. The laws Hammurabi created didn't just punish. They conditioned a society to accept pain as a necessary component of life. They told the people, your life, your suffering, your pain, it all has a price. The chronicles may be silent about the minds behind this system, but the remnants of the past speak loud and clear. Clay tablets, broken bones, and the remnants of bodies long gone are the true records of this terrifying and methodical system. If you value the record, subscribe. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The ancient world was no stranger to brutality, but it was the Romans who perfected it. They didn't just inflict pain, they engineered it. And at the heart of this engineering was crucifixion, a punishment so horrifying that it transcended mere torture and became the pinnacle of Roman power, a spectacle designed not just to end a life, but to break a spirit, to disempower entire populations through the calculated manipulation of suffering. But what made crucifixion different from the countless other forms of execution across history? It wasn't just about death, it was about control. And it was about sending a public message to anyone who might dare to oppose the might of the empire. Roman crucifixion was a carefully designed process, not just for physical agony, but for psychological warfare. The victim was not killed quickly. They were forced to linger, nailed to a wooden post for hours or even days, their body slowly suffocating under its own weight, their lungs filling with fluid, their muscles seizing in excruciating spasms. The result wasn't just a dead body, it was broken dignity. But who conceived of this method of punishment? And more importantly, who saw its value? The answer lies in Rome's unparalleled ability to turn suffering into a public spectacle. Crucifixion wasn't a secretive, isolated act of violence. It was a performance for the people, an event meant to be seen, remembered, and, above all, feared. To understand the mind behind this form of punishment, we must first understand Rome's view of power. The Romans saw the body as the ultimate site of control. Whether through public execution or slavery, the body was the most visible symbol of Rome's dominance. To the Roman rulers, if they could control the body, they could control the soul. But control wasn't enough for them. The Romans wanted obedience, and obedience was best achieved by instilling fear. Crucifixion was designed to break the will of the individual, but it also served as a warning to everyone who witnessed it. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. This is what happens when you challenge the order of things. And the message was reinforced time and time again for all to see. The victims were often criminals, but rebels, insurrectionists, and even political dissidents were common targets for crucifixion. Crucifixion was more than just punishment. It was a tool of political control. The Romans used it to crush resistance before it could spread, using it to set examples that would echo through the streets, through the towns, through the very heart of the empire. Perhaps the most famous of these public displays was the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Not just a religious martyrdom, but an event that symbolized the ultimate Roman power. Jesus was executed publicly, not just as a religious figure, but as a political threat. His crucifixion sent a message to any who would challenge Roman authority, not just in Judea, but across the empire. Rebellion would be met with the most horrific of consequences. But what makes crucifixion such a powerful tool of control was the psychological aspect. Imagine, for a moment, the spectacle of it all. The victim was often stripped naked, humiliated, and publicly displayed in a place of high visibility. The cross itself was positioned for maximum exposure, at the gates of cities, along roadsides, outside of the forum. This was theatre, and it was designed to scar the soul as much as the body. As the victim hung there, writhing in pain, their slow death served as a grim reminder of what would happen to anyone who dared to resist. Death wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the victim was made to live with the shame and pain until the bitter end. The soul was broken long before the body gave way. The Romans understood something that many civilizations before them didn't. the visibility of suffering was what made it most effective. Crucifixion wasn't a private affair, it was a public, civic act, one that brought the punishment into the very heart of Roman life. It was pain as propaganda, a tool used to ensure that the populace remained docile, that they feared the system and understood their place within it. The cost of defiance was on full display for all to witness. The mind behind this was not that of a sadist, but that of a strategist, someone who saw power not in the abstract, but in the very bodies of the people. Control was achieved not by conquest, but by the very fear of death itself. And yet, it wasn't just the rulers who benefited from this. The people too played a part in the machinery of cruelty. They were the witnesses, the spectators who cheered or jeered, who saw the spectacle of suffering unfold before their eyes. And in doing so, they became complicit in the system. They weren't just passive observers, they were part of the machine. Their acceptance of the violence was, in itself, a form of consent. Consent to a world where suffering was public, where pain was normalized, where control was enforced through fear. But what happens when the system of power becomes routine? When the public sees not just one crucifixion, but hundreds, thousands, and the pain becomes institutionalized? What happens when death itself becomes predictable, and when the people no longer react with shock, but with acceptance? This is the true power of the Roman system, a machine that grinds down not just the body, but the soul. As the empire grew, so did its methods of control. Crucifixion was just one example of how the Romans perfected the art of using pain and fear as instruments of governance. And though crucifixion may have faded from history, the logic behind it remains. A logic that still resonates in the systems of control we see today. As the Roman Empire fell, its legacy of fear and control lived on. The methods of physical domination that had been perfected on the crucifixion crosses were carried into the medieval period, where the art of suffering was refined and institutionalized in horrifying new ways. While Rome's cruelty was a public spectacle, the Middle Ages introduced a more intimate, systematic form of pain, a pain that was not just inflicted on the body, but on the very soul of the condemned. The medieval world saw the rise of the Inquisition, a brutal tool of religious and political control. But it wasn't just about religious persecution. It was about using torture as truth, a way to extract confessions and force compliance through fear. Torture became not only an instrument of punishment, but of interrogation and conviction. One of the most infamous torture devices of this era was the rack, a device designed to stretch the victim's body to the point of dislocation. The victim's arms and legs were tied to ropes, which were then wound around a spindle, slowly pulling the body apart. The physical agony was beyond imagination, but it wasn't just about the pain. It was about what the pain represented. The rack was designed to break the spirit, to make the person confess, to force them to submit to the will of the inquisitors. But it wasn't just the rack. The Middle Ages brought with it an entire toolkit of suffering. The Iron Maiden, a coffin-like device lined with spikes, was designed to puncture the body while the victim remained alive, slowly bleeding out in a sealed metal chamber. The breaking wheel, a device that twisted and shattered bones until the victim's body was mangled beyond recognition, was another popular means of execution. And then, of course, there was the pillory, the public display of humiliation, where the accused were locked into a wooden frame and displayed in the town square for all to see. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological. It was about stripping the person of their dignity, their humanity, in front of the community. These devices, designed for maximum pain and humiliation, were tools of governance. They were not just used to punish, they were used to control and remind the public of the cost of defiance. The medieval authorities, whether kings or inquisitors, were not just rulers. They were engineers of fear, constructing systems that turned pain into a necessary evil for maintaining order. But who were the architects of this era's cruelty? Inquisitors and executioners, men who understood the power of pain and fear better than anyone else. These individuals didn't just carry out punishments, they were true architects of human suffering, designing their instruments of torture with an eye toward efficiency. The greater the suffering, the greater the control. But the architects didn't only build the instruments, they built a society that was complicit in their use. The punishment wasn't just about the person being tortured, it was a public event. The townspeople gathered, watching with morbid fascination as the victims screamed and pleaded. They didn't just witness the pain, they were part of it. In the medieval world, pain became normalized. People began to see torture not as an aberration, but as a necessary tool for maintaining the moral and social order. This was the dark logic that governed medieval Europe, a logic that saw pain as a necessary evil. The philosophers and rulers of the time believed that human beings were inherently sinful, and that their souls could only be saved through suffering. Pain wasn't just about punishment, it was redemption. The suffering of the individual was seen as an expiation for the sins of the community. But this logic didn't end with the medieval period. As the centuries went on, the instruments of pain evolved, becoming more sophisticated and more terrifying. The science of suffering had been perfected, and its legacy would live on, not just in the torture chambers of the past, but in the prisons and institutions of the present. The medieval period was not just a time of religious and political control. It was a time when the architecture of suffering reached new heights. It was a time when pain was not just a consequence, it was a tool for shaping society. And the architects of this suffering, whether they were inquisitors or kings, were the ones who held the power, not just over life and death, but over the very souls of their people. But the most disturbing truth of all is this: the architects didn't just create systems of torture, they created systems of complicity. In the medieval world, the people didn't just endure the suffering, they witnessed it, cheered it, and, in many cases, supported it. They were part of the system, just as much as the executioners and inquisitors. And this is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the medieval machine of pain, that it wasn't just built by those in power, but by the very people who lived under it. So, when we look back at the instruments of torture that defined this dark chapter in history, we must ask, who were the real architects? Were they the kings and inquisitors, or were they the people who accepted and embraced this system of suffering? The chronicles may be gone, but the remnants of the past still speak to us, through the bones, through the archaeological evidence, and through the legacy of fear they left behind. As we move deeper into the history of human suffering, we begin to see the true cost of pain, not only on the bodies of those subjected to it, but also on the very soul of civilization. The medieval era didn't just rely on the same techniques of cruelty as the Romans. It refined them, incorporating new technologies and strategies that made suffering even more profound and calculable. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this progression was the rack. The rack was designed for one purpose: to break the spirit. It was an engineering marvel of terror, a device that stretched the body beyond its limits, dislocating joints and tearing muscles as the victim was pulled to their breaking point. But the rack was not just a tool of physical pain. It was a tool of psychological domination. The victim wasn't just being punished for their crimes. They were being forced into total submission. The rack became a stage for the ultimate test of will, where resistance was impossible and survival itself was contingent on a confession. This was no accident. The rack wasn't just an unfortunate outcome of medieval justice. It was a calculated method for obtaining absolute control over an individual. Torture was not simply about inflicting pain, it was about manipulating the mind. It was about forcing the victim to break, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually. The inquisitors who used the rack were not just torturers, they were manipulators of the human will, using pain as a means of achieving compliance and conformity. The rack's effectiveness lay in its ability to destroy the victim's ability to resist. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't the worst part. The true horror of the rack was the waiting, the endless, agonizing stretch of the body, the uncertainty of what was to come next. This slow, methodical process broke the mind more than the body, causing the victim to lose their sense of agency and control. In the end, it was this loss of self that made the rack so effective. It wasn't just the body that was shattered, it was the very identity of the victim. But the rack was only one of the many tools of torture developed during this time. The medieval period saw an entire toolkit of suffering, each designed for a specific purpose, each more horrifying than the last. The Iron Maiden, for instance, was designed to slowly puncture the body with sharp spikes, each inch of the body's surface becoming a target for death itself. The breaking wheel, another iconic device, would twist and shatter bones, leaving the victim's body mutilated and disfigured, often for hours before death took hold. These were not just execution devices. They were instruments of terror, meant to keep the public in a constant state of fear. But what made these devices even more disturbing was their public nature. Torture wasn't confined to the dungeon or the dark corners of the kingdom. It was put on display for all to see. The medieval rulers understood the power of spectacle, and they used it to their advantage. They knew that public executions, public torture, and public suffering were the most effective ways to ensure obedience. By displaying the punishment for rebellion and defiance, they turned pain into a lesson, and fear into a tool for maintaining order. This was the true purpose of the rack, the Iron Maiden, and the breaking wheel: to use pain as a spectacle, to advertise the consequences of defiance. It was a system of fear and compliance, designed to remind the people of their place in society. And it worked. The victims were not the only ones affected by this system. The public was complicit in the spectacle too. The crowds who gathered to watch the executions weren't just passive spectators. They were part of the system. They were participants in the spectacle of suffering, absorbing the lessons it taught. They were conditioned to see the tortured bodies as mere examples, reinforcing the message that disobedience would be punished and obedience would be rewarded. It's difficult to overstate how profound this influence was. The medieval period didn't just use pain as a tool of control, it normalized it. Pain became public, became routine. it became the mechanism of order. The ruling class didn't just inflict pain on criminals and rebels. They used pain to shape the very fabric of society, creating a world where every citizen knew their place and understood that to step out of line was to risk being destroyed by the system. And yet, despite the clear logic behind this system of terror, there were those who resisted. There were those who refused to be broken, those who fought back against the architects of pain. But even they couldn't escape the overwhelming force of the system. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the breaking wheel, they were all designed with a purpose, to ensure that resistance, no matter how strong, would eventually be crushed. The terrifying truth is this: the medieval system of torture wasn't just designed to punish. It was designed to create a world where pain, fear, and suffering were part of the natural order. It was about making the people complicit in their own subjugation, and making them accept the system of control that had been built to dominate them. The rulers knew that if they could control the body, they could control the mind, and ultimately, the soul. The medieval period may have perfected the architecture of suffering, but it was the Renaissance that brought new knowledge, new technologies, and new forms of cruelty. While human anatomy was beginning to be understood in ways that could save lives, the same knowledge was twisted to create more efficient, more prolonged forms of punishment. The people who designed these systems were not just torturers. They were scientists of pain, seeking to understand the body and exploit its weaknesses for the sake of control. The most chilling example of this new era of retribution came in the form of Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner of France. Sanson wasn't just an executioner. He was a man who turned the act of death into a technological procedure, removing the chaos and the unpredictability of earlier methods of execution and replacing them with efficiency. It was during the Renaissance that the guillotine was perfected, turning public execution into a mechanical process. The guillotine wasn't just a faster, more efficient method of execution. It was a symbol of the new rationalism sweeping through Europe. The same spirit that gave rise to the scientific revolution also brought a new approach to punishment, one that stripped away the human element of pain and suffering. It wasn't about breaking the spirit, as it had been with the rack or the breaking wheel. It was about clean, systematic death. The guillotine, for all its supposed efficiency, was a cold, mechanical execution of justice. It was a message, too, that the state could execute with precision, without passion, without the messiness of emotion. The victim was not a human being. They were a process. Their death was merely an event in the grand machine of order. But the guillotine wasn't the only technological advancement in the art of suffering. The Renaissance also saw the rise of anatomical studies, which allowed torturers and executioners to understand how the human body responded to pain. They began to understand, in increasingly sophisticated ways, just how much the human body could endure before breaking. They knew that pain could be prolonged through a series of precise, calculated methods. It was during this period that the most sophisticated torture chambers were constructed, places where not only the body, but the very soul of the victim could be stretched, broken, and bent to the will of the authorities. This is the twisted logic that guided the minds of the Renaissance architects of cruelty. If the body could be understood as a machine, then it could be manipulated, controlled, and, ultimately, broken. It was a system that saw pain not as something to be feared or avoided, but as something to be mastered, something to be studied and perfected. For the ruling elite, The ability to control life and death with such mechanical precision was a sign of power. It wasn't enough to simply hold life and death in their hands. They wanted to own it, to make it efficient and predictable. The guillotine was not just a method of execution, it was a symbol of the new, rational world order. The inquisitors, executioners, and philosophers of the Renaissance understood that the greatest power was the ability to control life and death through the logic of the state. And this control over death was not just about punishing criminals or enemies of the state. It was about creating an atmosphere of fear, a climate where obedience was the only acceptable behavior. In the Renaissance, the punishment of death became political, and its methods became rationalized. The spectacle of death became something that the state could control, not just for the sake of punishment, but as a means of control over the population. The death of one man became the lesson for everyone else. To defy the state was to risk becoming just another number in the executioner's ledger. The Renaissance also saw the advent of public trials, where the accused were not only punished, but their suffering was broadcasted for all to witness. The entire process, from trial to execution, was turned into a performance designed to reinforce the power of the state and its ability to control the body, the soul, and the very will of the people. As the Renaissance progressed, the very notion of punishment changed. What had once been an act of retribution became an act of administration. The very systems of law and order that had once been based on emotional vengeance were now based on the cold logic of the machine. Pain became not just something to be inflicted, it became something to be measured, optimized, and controlled. The legacy of the Renaissance architects of suffering is still with us today. From criminal justice systems that continue to use long, drawn-out sentences as a form of control to modern prisons that strip individuals of their humanity, the legacy of this cold rationalism continues to inform how we view justice and punishment. The use of torture, the design of death, and the manipulation of the human body are no longer as public as they were in the past, but they are no less effective. What we can learn from the Renaissance architects of suffering is this: when cruelty is rationalized and systematized, it becomes invisible. We may not see the rack or the Iron Maiden today, but we still live in a world where pain is carefully designed and administered, hidden behind walls, hidden in processes, and hidden in the logic of the systems that govern us. As the centuries rolled on, the instruments of cruelty evolved, but they were always justified. Whether it was the rack, the guillotine, or the hidden mechanisms of modern punishment, the logic behind them didn't simply fade with time. Instead, it was reinforced by the institutions that ruled over the society. The systems of law, religion, and political power didn't just allow cruelty to persist, they legitimized it, turning brutality into something that seemed not only necessary, but moral. The Catholic Church played a central role in the evolution of the medieval torture system. Under the banner of divine authority, religious leaders wielded the power to punish not just criminals, but anyone who dared to defy the doctrines of the Church. Heretics were not only seen as wrong, they were seen as demonic. To question the Church was to question God's will. And in this framework, the violence meted out upon these dissenters was justified as divine punishment. religious justifications for cruelty were not confined to the medieval period. They extended well into the modern era, especially during the colonial expansions, where entire populations were subjugated and exploited under the guise of spreading civilization and Christianity. Missionaries, priests, and kings alike preached that the natives must be converted or eliminated, and they used physical violence and torture as tools to achieve this divine mandate. Just as the medieval torturers had justified their actions as purifying the soul, colonizers redefined cruelty as a necessary act of salvation, cleansing the heathens of their sin and ignorance. The cruelty wasn't just for the benefit of the empire, it was for their souls. Yet, as brutal as religion's role was in the enforcement of suffering, it was legal systems that became the true blueprints for institutionalizing punishment on a massive scale. In medieval Europe, law codes like the Code of Justinian and the later English common law established systems that not only allowed, but in many cases required, physical punishment for a broad array of crimes. Public humiliation through floggings and public executions became commonplace, seen as tools of societal control. The rack, iron maiden, and other instruments were not just created for punishment's sake. They were created because they served a deeper purpose. The most effective punishment wasn't just about making a person suffer. It was about sending a message to everyone else. Public executions, torture chambers, and other forms of spectacle were designed not just to punish the individual, but to warn the larger population. The scapegoat strategy was a key element in how cruelty was normalized. By focusing attention on a single victim, society could redirect its own fears, frustrations, and sense of insecurity onto an individual. The public spectacle of their suffering served to reinforce the moral and social order, assuring the larger group that their safety depended on the eradication of the other, the criminal, the dissenter, or the heretic. The message was simple: those who suffered were wrong, and right society would always triumph over them. The scapegoat strategy was not just confined to public executions. It extended to the way entire communities, cultures, and races were demonized and marginalized. Whether it was the treatment of Jews during the medieval period, the enslavement of Africans during the colonial era, or the genocides committed in the name of nationalism in the 20th century, scapegoating was always part of the process. The suffering of one group justified the privilege of another. And in this twisted logic, punishment wasn't just a means of control, it was a tool of societal cohesion, drawing lines between the right and the wrong, the pure and the impure. Yet, there is something more insidious in this dynamic. It's not just that those in power use cruelty to maintain their hold. It's that the masses begin to accept it. As the spectacle of suffering became more embedded in society, it stopped being questioned. Pain and torture stopped being seen as inhumane and became necessary for maintaining order. The rulers and those in power understood this dynamic better than anyone. They knew that to control the masses, they had to normalize suffering, and as long as the people could see it as justified, they would never question the system. In many ways, this pattern still exists today, albeit in subtler forms. The prison industrial complex in modern societies, the treatment of political dissidents by authoritarian regimes, and the use of torture in the so-called war on terror all show us how the logic of cruelty has not only persisted, but has been repackaged and rebranded for the modern age. The techniques may be different, but the underlying philosophy that suffering can be used to maintain control remains the same. The great fear of the architects of suffering was that pain would one day be seen for what it truly is, not a means of order, but a manifestation of chaos. Control was the true goal of every act of brutality, and when control is lost, societies descend into anarchy. The only way to prevent this chaos was to keep pain tightly wrapped in the cloak of legitimacy. Whether through religion, law, or propaganda, the act of cruelty was always framed as necessary, as part of a greater social contract. But if history teaches us anything, it is that the power of pain can only be sustained for so long. Eventually, societies wake up to the truth. Pain, when normalized, does not keep the order. It destroys it. When cruelty is exposed for what it truly is, a means of subjugation, the structure built on its back begins to crumble. We must remember that every system of cruelty is ultimately unsustainable. When we look at the history of suffering, the message is clear. We are only as strong as our ability to recognize and challenge the systems that use pain to control us. Throughout history, scapegoating has been the essential mechanism by which societies have justified cruelty and suffering. At the heart of it, the scapegoat is not merely a victim. They are the catalyst for social order, the outlet through which society purges its collective fear, frustration, and anger. In the most horrifying cases, entire populations have been designated as scapegoats, subjected to horrific acts of violence and oppression, all to create a false sense of unity among the rest of society. The scapegoat strategy is rooted in the belief that society's problems can be solved by isolating and destroying a single target. This target is often the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and the easiest to demonize. By focusing society's collective rage on one individual or group, the greater social order can be maintained. In the medieval period, this scapegoating was often framed as a religious or moral imperative: the heretic, the witch, the infidel. In modern times, the enemy is often constructed based on race, ethnicity, religion, or political ideology. One of the most profound and tragic examples of the scapegoat strategy is the persecution of Jews in medieval Europe. Over the centuries, Jews were blamed for everything from plague outbreaks to economic instability. In times of hardship or uncertainty, it became a matter of convenience to label them as the root of society's ills. Public executions, torture, and expulsions were carried out in the name of purging this threat to the purity of the community. But the truth was far simpler. Jews were vulnerable, marginalized, and easy to target. They were othered, painted as the enemy, and used as a scapegoat to explain the unexplainable. Similarly, in times of political turmoil or war, the scapegoat serves as a rallying point. For example, during the Reign of Terror in France, citizens who were seen as potential enemies of the revolution were dragged into the streets and executed in horrific fashion. The fear of counter-revolutionary forces was so great that it became almost necessary to turn neighbors, former friends, and even family members into scapegoats for the perceived threat. Suspicion ruled, and the only way to secure one's safety was to point the finger at someone else. Even today, we see the power of the scapegoat strategy at work. Refugees and immigrants, often fleeing violence and poverty, are vilified and blamed for societal problems that have little to do with them. In authoritarian regimes, it's not uncommon to see political dissidents demonized, their rights stripped away, and their families persecuted, all in the name of maintaining power. The scapegoat serves to consolidate the power of the state by creating an enemy that can be publicly demonized, tortured, and destroyed. At its core, the scapegoat strategy operates on a psychological level. It's easier to blame one person or group for the suffering and hardship experienced by a society, rather than confronting the deeper, more systemic issues at play. By focusing collective frustration and fear on a single target, it allows society to displace its guilt and shift the burden of responsibility away from itself. The scapegoat becomes the symbol of evil, the embodiment of everything that's wrong in the world. And in this process, society's own failings are ignored. But there is a deeper danger in the scapegoating process. When an individual or group is subjected to violence, humiliation, and dehumanization, it's not just an individual that's harmed, it's the entire social fabric. In a society that condones scapegoating, cruelty becomes normalized. When violence is directed at one group, it becomes easier for others to justify violence directed at the next group. The more dehumanized the target, the easier it becomes for society to turn its back and accept their suffering. In this sense, the scapegoat doesn't just suffer for the wrongdoings of society. They represent the moral decay of that society. This is how systems of cruelty are perpetuated, through the dehumanization of others and the rationalization of their suffering. Once the scapegoat is in place, cruelty becomes easier to justify. The more isolated the target, the less likely society will question the methods of punishment or the legitimacy of the violence. Scapegoating has the effect of splitting society into those who are safe and those who are marked for destruction. This division doesn't just harm the scapegoat, it harms the entire social order. When societies operate on a foundation of cruelty, they become morally bankrupt. They lose their ability to recognize innocence, and as a result, innocence becomes increasingly rare. The normalization of cruelty leads to complicity, where people begin to accept the unacceptable. They stop questioning the methods of the powerful and start seeing the victim as guilty by virtue of their label. Perhaps the most insidious effect of scapegoating is that it creates an echo chamber of pain and suffering. Once cruelty is justified and normalized for one group, it becomes easier to justify it for others. The cycle of cruelty perpetuates itself, and with it, the moral erosion of society. The more victims there are, the harder it becomes to see the humanity of those being targeted. The scapegoat is not just a victim, they are a mirror, reflecting the darkness within a society. Every act of cruelty they endure is a symbol of what society is willing to accept. And each time we fail to recognize the innocence of those who are made to suffer, we move further away from the possibility of a just world. Throughout history, the instruments of pain and suffering have not only been tools of control, they have also been depicted, immortalized, and sometimes even glorified in art. The legacy of torture is not just present in the execution chambers and dungeons. It has been etched into the very fabric of human culture. In literature, painting, and sculpture, suffering is witnessed, analyzed, and romanticized, creating a complex and often unsettling relationship between beauty and brutality. In the medieval period, torture was not something hidden in the shadows. It was public, and it was meant to be seen. The torturer, whether a religious inquisitor or a royal executioner, was often depicted as a figure of power. Art from this period, like the illuminated manuscripts and engraving prints, frequently portrayed acts of violence as divine intervention or necessary for the greater good. The religious context was clear. Those who suffered in the name of God were seen as martyrs, and their suffering was often depicted as something holy, something that cleansed the soul. Take, for example, the crucifixion scenes painted in the medieval and Renaissance periods. The image of Jesus nailed to the cross was one of the most frequent depictions in Christian art, and it symbolized not just the pain of Christ, but the sacrifice made for the salvation of mankind. But over time, these images became more than just religious symbols. They were glorified depictions of suffering, where the physical agony of the body was shown in exquisite detail, often to the point where the art itself became a celebration of the body's ability to endure pain. The beauty of suffering became a cultural ideal, with artists honing their craft to capture not only the physical pain, but the moral purity that came from enduring it. The Inquisition provided another example of how suffering and torture became deeply ingrained in culture. Artists of the time would often create visual representations of hell, full of tortured souls, demonic figures, and torturers, some of whom were depicted as almost heroic figures. The torturer was not a villain, but an instrument of God's wrath, executing divine justice. One of the most famous examples of this comes from the hell scenes in the works of Hieronymus Bosch, whose painting The Garden of Earthly Delights features numerous depictions of torture and punishment, illustrating the consequences of sin through nightmarish imagery. But torture was not only glorified in religious contexts. In literature, the themes of pain, punishment, and torture were woven into the fabric of storytelling. The French Revolution brought about the guillotine, and it wasn't long before literature began to romanticize the process of execution. Writers like Victor Hugo and Charles Dickens wrote about the suffering of the downtrodden in ways that made readers feel empathy for the victims of cruelty, while also reflecting the brutality of the institutions that perpetuated it. The public executions in these works are not just scenes of death, but moments of profound social commentary, where torture becomes a means of critique. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, art continued to explore the intersection of beauty and suffering. Artists like Francisco Goya painted the capricious cruelty of war, the torture of the oppressed, and the suffering of individuals at the hands of power. His famous series of prints, The Disasters of War, depicted the graphic horrors of warfare and its resulting torture, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete personal experience. The brutality of these works was meant to disturb, to make the viewer question the moral foundation of a world that allows such suffering to persist. Yet, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this historical glorification of suffering is that these depictions were not purely condemnatory. They normalized the cruelty. Artists, writers, and thinkers of various eras made suffering part of the cultural narrative, humanizing it, making it something that was endured as a necessity, either for redemption, for order, or as a punishment for sin. Even in the modern world, torture and pain have been woven into our collective imagination in ways that sanction them, even when we condemn them. Consider the popularity of horror films, which often feature characters being tortured, often by malevolent figures who are in positions of power. The tension created by these depictions can make us complicit in the suffering of others, even as we recoil in horror. We are invited to witness pain, to look into the face of cruelty, and yet we often feel as though it is disconnected from real-world suffering. Art and literature are not just reflections of reality, they shape it. When society consistently represents pain in art, it creates a moral framework that rationalizes suffering. By romanticizing, glorifying, or distancing ourselves from the truth of what torture represents, we condition ourselves to accept that pain can be justified in certain circumstances. This is perhaps one of the most dangerous aspects of the legacy of torture in culture, its ability to desensitize us. By depicting suffering as a tool for redemption, as a symbol of strength, or as an act of moral clarity, we risk losing sight of its true nature. Pain becomes something that we celebrate, something that we normalize, even when it should be condemned. But history has taught us one crucial lesson. Pain, when used as a tool of control, is never truly justified. The images we carry with us, the artistic depictions of suffering, are not just representations of the past, they are a warning. If we continue to normalize suffering in our culture, we risk allowing the architects of pain to continue building systems that thrive on fear, control, and dehumanization. The history of torture and punishment is not just preserved in the physical remnants of execution sites or the macabre devices used to inflict pain. It is also preserved in records, official documents, executioners' diaries, legal codes, and archival materials that have, for centuries, served as both proof of brutality and justifications for it. These documents are the silent witnesses to the systems of control, fear, and suffering that were not only sanctioned, but often celebrated by those in power. One of the most chilling aspects of this historical documentation is how pain and suffering were reduced to statistics, rules, and legal procedures. The chronicles of executioners, found in medieval manuscripts and personal diaries, detail the methods used in torture chambers, how much time each victim spent in agony, and what tools were most effective in extracting confessions or ensuring a swift execution. These records are not just grim accounts. They are blueprints for a society that measured pain not as an act of cruelty, but as a process, a way of extracting truth, ensuring order, and maintaining control. Take, for instance, the records kept by Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner of France. Sanson wasn't just the man who administered public executions during the French Revolution. He was also a meticulous documenter of his craft. His diaries detail not just the victims, but also the precision with which he performed his duties. The guillotine, though considered a more humane execution device compared to the rack or the breaking wheel, was seen by Sanson as an art, a technical process that required skill and knowledge. His diary entries reflect the cold efficiency with which he carried out death, noting how many seconds it took for the blade to fall and the reaction of the crowd. To Sanson and others like him, death was not an emotional act. It was a professional duty. But executioners were not the only ones keeping records. Legal documents from the medieval and early modern periods describe in great detail the laws that permitted torture, the conditions under which it was allowed, and the justifications for its use. The Spanish Inquisition, for example, kept extensive records of the torture used to extract confessions from heretics, witches, and political dissenters. These records outline the methods used, such as the water torture and the breaking wheel, and justify these methods in the name of truth and faith. Torture, as far as the inquisitors were concerned, was not a crime. It was a necessary tool in the fight against heresy. These legal codes are chilling in their detail, outlining step by step how a criminal or dissenter should be punished, what devices should be used, and how long they should endure their suffering. These legal documents were not isolated or rare. They were part of the mainstream legal process of many societies. They created the framework for social control, just as the instruments of torture created the physical framework for human suffering. But these records, though they remain largely silent, also tell us something more. They tell us about the human condition. The detachment with which these documents were written reflects the way societies became desensitized to the pain of others. The fact that these legal codes existed at all, and that they were accepted by the population, reveals how deeply embedded cruelty had become in the fabric of society. These records were not seen as instruments of oppression by those who created them. They were simply seen as necessary parts of maintaining order. One of the most disturbing aspects of these historical records is how pain and suffering were so deeply intertwined with the very idea of justice. Torture was justified in many instances as a moral imperative. Whether it was the belief in divine retribution, the desire to purify the soul, or the need to maintain social order, these records normalize suffering as a necessary part of the human experience. It was as if pain was a fundamental part of how humans related to the divine, to each other, and to the state. In some ways, these records serve as evidence of the moral decay of societies that could justify such cruelty. When torture became institutionalized, it reflected not just the cruelty of the rulers, but the willingness of the people to accept such systems of control. The acceptance of these systems created a vicious cycle, where cruelty became normalized and expected as part of the social contract. But there is a critical lesson in these records. They are not just documents of a past filled with suffering. They are warnings. When we look at these records today, we are forced to confront the ways in which societies have justified dehumanization, and how easily it can be rationalized and institutionalized. The terrifying truth is this: if we are not vigilant, we may find ourselves repeating the mistakes of the past, creating new forms of suffering, and justifying them under the guise of necessity or order. As we continue to examine these records, the lesson becomes clearer. Pain is not the enemy. The systems that justify it, that reduce human suffering to a mere tool for governance and control, those are the real enemy. We must understand the historical cost of such systems so that we do not fall prey to them again. The deeper one looks into history's archives, the more one realizes that cruelty never truly disappears. It merely changes its handwriting. Every empire, every era, left its records of repression, inked on parchment, etched on stone, or buried beneath the weight of bureaucracy. The words may differ: justice, purification, deterrence, but the purpose remains the same: to give structure to suffering and to make it seem reasonable. In Rome, ledgers listed the number of slaves crucified after an uprising, recorded like trade receipts. In medieval Europe, inquisitors wrote formal reports on the degrees of pain a body could endure before truth emerged. In France, executioners like Sanson kept immaculate diaries of the condemned. Names, crimes, dates, even the crowd's applause. And in the 20th century, Nazi administrators documented genocide with the precision of accountants, filling forms, counting teeth, measuring ash. The cruelty was no longer performed in public squares, it was conducted in offices with pens. The racks had turned into typewriters, the chains into filing cabinets. the logic remained the same. When archaeologists unearth bones beneath forgotten courtyards or prisons, they are not just finding the dead, they are decoding the paperwork of pain. A fractured wrist speaks of restraint. A spine twisted at an impossible angle speaks of design. Every injury has its own ledger entry, its own bureaucratic author. The documents of repression were not destroyed. They were merely filed under new departments, written in the language of order. A report, a decree, a command. Every paper trail is a ghost that whispers, "This was done properly." Even art and architecture served the archive. The torture chambers of the Inquisition were constructed to amplify screams. Their walls curved to project agony outward like sound in a cathedral. The execution squares of Paris and London were designed for visibility, their platforms positioned for maximum spectacle. And centuries later, totalitarian regimes built ministries, courts, and interrogation rooms in the same rational grid. Sterile, white, soundproof. Proof that the modern age no longer needed blood in the streets. It could break people in silence. The most haunting archives are not the written ones, but the forgotten ones. A rusted shackle in a dungeon. A brick floor worn smooth by chained feet. A single fingernail embedded in stone. These fragments are not relics. They are the metadata of horror, each one confirming that pain was not random, but administered. And yet, buried within these records is something even more unsettling: our continuity. Because every society that came after inherited the administrative reflex to document, to justify, to categorize. Modern democracies still write reports about enhanced interrogation. Most police records still quantify violence in numbers instead of wounds. Governments still classify cruelty under euphemisms like national security, reform, or rehabilitation. The words have changed. The architecture has not. Every cell block, every solitary confinement chamber, every secret detention site is a descendant of Babylon's tablets, Rome's crucifixions, and the Inquisition's scripts. The archive, then, is not just a record of what was done. It is a manual for what can be done again. History's greatest lie is that cruelty belongs to the past, when in truth, it was archived for reference. And so, when we open those brittle pages or stand before those bones, we are not simply learning about the dead. We are learning about ourselves, how much we are willing to record, how much we are willing to ignore, and how easily we mistake documentation for justice. The question that remains is the same one Hammurabi first posed in stone, the same one whispered beneath Rome's crosses and the Inquisition's pyres. Who decides how much pain is permitted, and who writes it down? Because every age answers that question differently, and every answer becomes the next archive. The modern world likes to believe it has outgrown cruelty. We build monuments to human rights, sign treaties against torture, and speak of civilization as if pain were a relic of barbaric times. But beneath the polished glass of our courthouses and the sterile walls of our prisons, the same old architecture of anguish still stands, redesigned, rebranded, and rendered invisible. The rack has been replaced by psychological isolation, the breaking wheel by bureaucracy, the iron maiden by administrative indifference. Cruelty has evolved. It no longer needs iron spikes or blood-stained floors. It works through delay, denial, surveillance, and silence. Every modern government that claims to protect its citizens also retains the power to destroy them in measured, legal, increments. The tools of pain have shifted from the physical to the procedural. In the age of digital systems and biometric data, suffering is no longer carved into flesh, it is coded into policy. Look closely at the prison systems of the 21st century. They are the modern descendants of the Inquisition's chambers. Only now the walls are white, the lighting fluorescent, and the chains psychological. Inmates spend years in solitary confinement, a punishment proven to drive the mind toward hallucination and despair. It is a punishment designed not to extract confession, but to erase identity. No blood, no screams, no public audience. And yet, it achieves the same goal, the administration of submission. The bureaucrat has become the new executioner. He doesn't swing an axe or tighten a rope. He signs a document, files a report, or checks a box. A visa denial, a deportation order, a black site transfer. Pain no longer needs spectacle. It thrives in paperwork. This is the modern genius of cruelty. It hides behind procedure, legitimized by the very systems built to prevent it. The language of cruelty has also evolved. The word torture is replaced with enhanced interrogation. Detention replaces imprisonment. Correctional facility replaces prison. Each euphemism erases the moral clarity that once allowed us to see violence for what it is. In this linguistic fog, cruelty becomes palatable, almost ethical. Governments justify suffering not through divine will, but through data, risk assessment, and national security. And if the medieval church used confession to control the soul, modern regimes use surveillance to control the mind. The camera replaces the cross. The database replaces the dungeon. In this new order, punishment begins long before any crime is committed, because the fear of being watched is enough to ensure obedience. The panopticon, once a philosophical concept, is now the architecture of the everyday. We have built societies that no longer need torturers, because we have learned to torture ourselves through conformity, anxiety, and constant exposure. Cruelty has been made efficient, clean, and invisible. It no longer demands a crowd to witness it, only a system to record it. Every citizen is now both observer and participant, much like the medieval audience who gathered around the scaffold. We scroll past images of war, oppression, and suffering on our screens, detached and numbed, convinced that awareness itself absolves us of complicity. But watching is not the same as resisting. In many ways, it is the modern form of participation, passive, perpetual, and profitable. Modern technology has perfected what ancient tyrants only imagined: control without contact, obedience without blood, fear without spectacle. We live inside the dream Hammurabi began, a world where law, fear, and pain are all part of the same equation, written in the digital code of governance. The architects of Anguish are no longer blacksmiths or inquisitors. They are designers, legislators, and engineers, people who build systems so seamless that cruelty disappears into their function. But beneath the layers of technology and bureaucracy, the question remains unchanged. How much suffering is acceptable in the name of stability? Every society answers that question differently, yet always with the same rationale: that pain, when properly managed, is necessary for order. That belief has survived every revolution, every enlightenment, every promise of progress. It is the invisible cornerstone of modern civilization. Because cruelty when it becomes rational, is no longer seen as cruelty at all. It becomes policy. And the modern blueprint of pain is the most terrifying one yet, because it requires no villains, only compliance, only silence, only us. Every civilization believes it has transcended cruelty, that the bones beneath its streets belong to another, darker age. But cruelty never vanishes. It only changes its architecture. And the question that has haunted us since Babylon remains unanswered. Who designs the systems that decide who suffers, and who profits from that suffering? For 4,000 years, we have built our cities, our laws, our faiths, and our economies upon the premise that pain has purpose, that suffering disciplines, that punishment restores balance, that order requires someone, somewhere, to bear the cost. It is this logic, elegant, ancient, lethal, that every empire has inherited and refined. Hammurabi codified it in stone. Rome engineered it in wood and iron. The Church sanctified it in faith. The Renaissance measured it in anatomy. And the modern world digitized it into policy. The architecture changed, but the blueprint never did, because at its foundation lies one enduring equation. Power equals the right to define who deserves to hurt. But what happens when that right is questioned? What happens when humanity begins to understand that pain, once treated as justice, is, in truth, the failure of imagination? To dismantle the architecture of anguish, we must first confront its beauty, because cruelty has always disguised itself as design. The symmetry of a courtroom, the efficiency of a prison block, the cold precision of a drone strike. Each of these is a monument to order, and yet each hides the same primitive truth. We still build our systems to hurt, not to heal. If history has taught us anything, it's that cruelty thrives in silence and reason. The executioner's swing once drew screams. Now, the bureaucrat's signature draws applause. And so long as suffering is administered by logic, by law, by algorithm, by efficiency, we will mistake it for progress. But perhaps the architects of tomorrow will design differently. Perhaps their blueprints will measure not pain, but dignity. Perhaps their ledgers will record not the cost of suffering, but the value of mercy. For the first time in human history, we have the power to see every ledger, every archive, every system of control laid bare. We know the pattern, we can trace the design, and knowledge, if used rightly, can become the first tool of reconstruction. To build a world beyond cruelty is not to erase our past, it is to understand it. It is to recognize that the same intelligence that once built instruments of torture can build instruments of compassion. That the same administrative precision that once counted bodies can be turned to counting lives preserved. That the same need for order that once justified suffering can be reimagined as the discipline of empathy. The question then is no longer, who designed the pain? It is, who will redesign the future? Because every era produces its own architects, and every society must choose what they build. The ledgers of history are full, their ink dark with blood and silence. But the next page is still blank. And perhaps for the first time, we may decide not to fill it with anguish, but with understanding. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. But what they say next, that finally might be up to us.